All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the last episode of Chapter 4. We're going to cover sections 4.13 through 4.22 from your Campbell Biology Concepts and Connections textbook from Pearson Education Incorporated. Now, in this section, we're going to talk mostly about the mitochondria and how the cell gets energy, a little bit about the cytoskeleton, and how cells are connected to one another. All right, so mitochondria are organelles that carry out cellular respiration. Now, cellular respiration is the name of the chemical reaction that in which organisms gain energy from the environment. Okay, and so basically all eukaryotic cells use cellular respiration, and basically all eukaryotic cells use mitochondria to do so. Like I said before, cellular respiration converts chemical energy in foods to chemical energy as ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. You probably remember me talking briefly about ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And yes, this A right here is the same A from that is the AGCT in DNA. So mitochondria are responsible for cellular respiration, which is responsible for converting chemical energy in food to chemical energy as ATP that can be used inside the cell. The mitochondria, let's just talk about the structure really quick. Mitochondria are kind of bean-shaped cellular structures, okay, look like this. And they have two internal compartments. They have two membranes. They have between two membranes. We have two kind of an internal and external. Each one of these has just like I showed you before. Each line here is going to equal a phospholipid bilayer, just like I showed you in the last video. So we have two phospholipid bilayers inside the mitochondria. All right. The inner membrane space is this really kind of narrow space that wraps in between the two membranes, why we call it the inner membrane space. And then the mitochondrial matrix, which contains the DNA and the ribosomes and the enzymes, is in this center portion. So we have two areas. We have the mitochondrial matrix, the center, which is where we have DNA and enzymes and ribosomes that can produce new enzymes. And then we have the inner membrane space, which is just this narrow region between the two membranes. Now, it doesn't look quite like I showed you just a second ago. So it's a little bit more complex than that. The inner membrane is folded like this to increase the surface area of that inner membrane. Okay, and then each one of these little folds from here to here are called cristae. Okay, so the cristae are each one of those little folds that increases the surface area, increases the amount of inner mitochondrial membrane, because that's where we have embedded enzymes that are responsible for converting energy. And so the mitochondria look like, in cross-section, they look like this. So here's your typical mitochondria inside a cell. We have that inner membrane space, and then there's an outer membrane, inner membrane space, inner membrane, mitochondrial matrix. This is the way that goes. So outer membrane is out here, okay, outer membrane, inner mitochondrial or inner membrane space, inner mitochondrial membrane, and then the matrix. All right, and then moving on to the other way that cells get energy is through photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is the conversion of light energy from sun to the chemical energy of sugar molecules. So chloroplasts are the photosynthesizing organelles of plants. And a chloroplast is set up much the same way as a mitochondria. We have this external membrane, okay, out here, like that. And then we have an inner membrane like this, okay? And then that inner membrane is continuous with these interesting little structures called thylakoids. Okay, they're all connected together to one like that. And those are the light collecting organelles, or the light collecting kind of parts of the cell. Okay. And we're going to talk more about cellular energy in Chapter 7, which is a few sections from now. It's next unit, but or it's not even the next unit. It's a unit after the next unit. So we have some time before or maybe it is the next unit. It is the next unit. So we have some time though before we start talking too much about cellular energy. Just know that chloroplasts are responsible for photosynthesis, and then mitochondria are responsible for cellular respiration. Okay, so the breakdown of sugar to ATP is mitochondria, and light into sugar is chloroplasts. Both of these things contain DNA, and they also contain ribosomes that are separate from the actual cell that they exist within. Okay, when you take the DNA and you look at the ribosomes, they look much more similar to prokaryotes than they do to eukaryotes. Okay, so if you find something existing inside another organism that's more related to something else than it is to the organism that it's inside of, then your thought would be that that organism began as a symbiotic relationship where one organism lived inside the other organism and then became dependent on the organism for which it was living inside, and to the point where it it basically can't live life any longer without being inside that organism. And so that's what the endosymbiotic theory states, is basically that endosymbiotic theory is that mitochondria and chloroplasts were formerly these small prokaryotes, and then they began living within these larger cells and utilizing the nutrient-rich environment of the cytoplasm. All right, so that process probably looks something like this, where we had an organism, a big eukaryotic organism that had a really nutrient-rich cytoplasm, and then it engulfed some prokaryote that could utilize that external or that environment and did so very efficiently, and that became the mitochondria. And then later on, engulfed another prokaryote that could extract energy from the sun, and then had that live inside itself also, and then you had the lineage that led to plants. Okay, and so that's basically, and that's really general, not very specific about the energy harvesting organelles, but that's all the further I really want to get into it for now. We're going to go into way more detail next unit. All right, now the next thing is that cells contain a network of protein fibers called the cytoskeleton. So if we have a cell, okay, that cell is just kind of a glob like that, and in order to hold its shape, you have to have all these kind of protein-like structures that kind of emanate out and maintain the shape of that cell so that it can stay the circle that it is. All right, there are three different kinds of cytoskeleton elements. We have microtubules, which are made out of proteins, and they kind of exist as this kind of coil of proteins, and they're pretty big. And then we have intermediate filaments that are a little bit smaller, also made out of coiled up proteins, kind of looks like a Twizzlers pull and peel. And then we have microfilaments, which are really, really small by comparison, about half the size of all the others, a half or a third the size of the other ones. And they're teeny, teeny, tiny, just two kind of protein strands interwound with one another. And they also work together to kind of hold the structure of the cell. Each one of these has different things that they do inside the cell. Microtubules are really responsible for anything that needs to be moved. So if you need to move DNA, or if you need to move other molecules, or if you need to move the cell itself, you can use these microtubules in cilia and things like that. Intermediate filaments and microfilaments are really for structure of the cell. Okay, animal cells synthesize and secrete, and this is now moving on to the next part, an elaborate extracellular matrix, okay, the ECM, which helps hold cells together and in tissues, and then protects and supports the plasma membrane. So if we have a plasma membrane like this, okay, outside of the cell, that's really not enough and we have all these protein fibers inside holding the shape. That's really not enough for the cell to exist in the world. It needs more structures all over the outside like this to kind of hold it into place in the external environment also. And then kind of all around out here, there's a environment, kind of an external environment that's full of all kinds of enzymes and proteins that help protect it. And so all of those kind of put together are called the extracellular matrix. There's an image in your book that's really good. There's all kinds of proteins that have sugars attached to them called glycoproteins. There's collagen fibers is a protein, a big protein that can be excreted and put outside of the cell. There are glycoproteins that connect together or connect to collagen fibers. And then within the plasma membrane, there are specialized proteins that can connect to those protein fibers that are floating on the outside and connect to the microfilaments of the cytoskeleton on the inside. So it's a very, very complex kind of network of interactions that are going on in and around the cell to kind of keep the shape of the cell. All right, another thing about cells is that cells that are next to each other will adhere and interact and communicate to one another through these very specialized junctions between them, of which there are three different kinds. There are tight junctions, which will prevent the leakage of fluid across a layer of epithelial cells. So if you want to maintain an external environment and an internal environment, and between those we have just a thin layer of cells, You need these tight junctions in between it. It doesn't allow anything to skip between the two layers. And then we have anchoring junctions, which will keep cells together, okay, so that they can't be broken apart. And then gap junctions, which are just channels that allow cytoplasm to stream between two cells. And so let me give you an example in animal cells. Here is a human cell, or well, a kind of an example of an animal cell. You can see that it's very tall and not very wide, and so that kind of indicates what kind of cell it is. It is a single layer thick, so there's connective tissue down here. And so we have an external environment out here, okay, that's different from the internal environment in here. So in order to not let any of this kind of blue stuff get through, there are these tight junctions that kind of bounce all that stuff back out. Okay, so no blue stuff is getting through. And you also don't want red stuff getting out, right? So you don't want any of this stuff getting out, so it kind of gets pushed back in after that. Okay, and then we have anchoring junctions right here that hold these cells together so that they don't get disrupted by any kind of friction, kind of pulling or pushing on the tissue types. And then lastly, we have gap junctions, which are responsible right here, which are responsible for allowing the kind of internal fluid inside this cell to make its way from one cell into the next cell, and from this cell over into this cell. And then that way you can send proteins and signals and things like that so that the cells are doing the same job. There's a lot of the same kinds of things we see in plants. So in plants, we see the same sort of thing, except for they have a rigid cell wall. Okay, so plant cells have a really rigid cell wall, and so they have to have specialized gap junctions, and those gap junctions are called plasmodesmata. Plasmodesmata, which are just where this rigid cell wall just kind of is connected between two cells, and you have this gap where they can stream their cytoplasm between the two of them and communicate. So the plant is all doing the same job. Okay, and with that, I'm going to go ahead and say goodbye. That's the end of chapter 4. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I will see you in class. Make sure you read.